Hello, my name is Dr. Vyvyane Low, and you're on vlmd Rounds, a podcast on medical science and tools to optimize your health. Please check out my website, vlmd.com, for a schedule of my live stream Q&A events. That's vyvyane.com. And I try to do those live stream events relatively frequently. And these are opportunities for you to bring me your questions or share a little bit about your own metabolic health journey. And it's also a chance for me to get to know you and learn about what might be helpful for you to hear about on these podcast episodes. Okay, so that would be on the website. Now, for today's episode, before I begin, I just want to set some context around it. Ever since I started the podcast, people have come up to me to give feedback, which I truly appreciate, and also to ask me what my objective was in doing this podcast. And really, there's a few reasons that I started this. The first one is to provide a resource for my patients and also other people who might be interested in health. I wanted to have these videos, these episodes made on various aspects of health that people could listen to and go back and listen to over and over again, and then think about how they want to incorporate some of these things into their own health practices. All right, so that's one. I actually, with my patient population, I teach classes every week, anywhere from 7 to 8 classes per week. And I've been doing this for almost 8 years nonstop, never took a week off, right? So that's a lot of classes. Each class would last about an hour to an hour and a half. And oftentimes, patients would come up to me afterwards or in a one-on-one visit and say, when you were talking about such and such a thing, can you repeat that again? Because I missed that. I got distracted and I didn't take notes, blah, blah, blah. And then I would find myself going through, everything all over again. So I thought that if I actually recorded some of this information, they could go back and listen and clarify things for themselves. And then if they still had questions beyond that, they could come and ask me directly. So that's really one reason. It would make it easier for them, and it would make it far easier for myself. And then the other thing is that, my patients are very interested in their own health. So they go about reading things on social media or just regular media. And then they have all kinds of questions because oftentimes they hear conflicting pieces of information. So then I would have to go and look up those sources or those posts and try and make some sense out of it to clarify things for my patients. And there are many people, I think, who are out there who are really passionate about bringing lots of good information to patients, and I truly appreciate that because they care about people's health. And sometimes, though, in their passion, they maybe get a little fuzzy around the edges on some of the concepts that they're trying to discuss. Or they may not pick up on the fact that someone else is talking about a slightly different thing. It sounds somewhat the same, it looks somewhat the same, but it's actually quite different. And that's when we start to get, misunderstandings and misinformation. And I thought it'd be a good idea maybe to try to clarify some of the fuzziness around some of these concepts. I certainly don't know everything, but there are some things I've been listening to on and off for a long time, for many years. And I thought, okay, at least those things, let's try to clarify. And if there's stuff I don't know, then all of us can put our heads together and at least look at the problem, in a unified way. So that's another reason that I, started to make this podcast. And then, of course, I'm very interested in science. There are many topics that I have been really trying to read up on and think about for years and years. Big topics like atherosclerosis and dementia and immunometabolism. These are the things I'm really passionate about. And I would love to be able to start talking about these topics on the podcast. But again, before we get to those huge topics, I think it's a good idea to get everyone on the same page. Not everyone has a science background. And even if you have a science background, it could be in a completely different field like engineering and so forth. And so, because a lot of these things involve the, medical field, I thought let's just clarify what we're talking about, basic concepts first before we go on to have these big, really fascinating topics. And then I get asked, so are you just going to be talking by yourself on the podcast? And have you thought about having guests? And yes, I definitely plan to have guests. I've always thought that I would have guests on this podcast. But again, before I do, I'm trying to build up a base, a foundation, so we all know we're talking about the same thing before, we start inviting people. And I do have in mind some very exciting people who've done great work. Maybe they're not famous in the general sense, but they're really brilliant in their fields. And those are the people I'd like to highlight on this podcast. And I, will start inviting them and bringing them onto this show in the coming months. So that is a plan. And then finally, of course, I do love science. And I really am interested in thinking hard about interesting topics and science subjects and having really meaningful discussions from other people, because I learn so much from everyone else. But one thing I find in science that, maybe sometimes we forget is that all of us come from our own personal biases. We all have our own cognitive distortions, if you will, whatever our stand, right? Whatever we bring to the topic. So a lot of times we like to think of science as being objective, and we forget that because we're interpreting the data and we are making some kind of judgment based on the data, that it can't be truly objective. There's always a subjective sense there. There's always a personal bias, right? And I think it's very important to recognize that when we have a discussion, because, when you listen to people give presentations nowadays, they give their disclosures, right? If they're funded by, certain institutions and who they're working with. Well, I think part of our disclosure should be our own personal biases. And if we don't even recognize our own personal biases, then that's a bad place to start. With my patient population, we really emphasize, cognitive distortions. We're helping our patients think about their own thinking, right? And so we're not exempt. So we insist on that amongst ourselves as well. When I have discussions or meetings with Anna or Driss, who are on my team, we're constantly evaluating our own cognitive distortions, So it's not uncommon for us to each personally recognize, oh, you know what? I'm probably mind reading at this point, or that's all or nothing thinking, right? Or, at this point, I'm just, projecting, right? So we're trying in our own way to recognize our own biases. It's not going to be 100%, but I think at least there should be some recognition that we come from some kind of bias to begin with, all right? I say this, and I'm going to let you know that, and it's obvious I've never hidden this, right? My recommendations in terms of nutrition have always been animal-based proteins, right? Low carb, and definitely low or no ultra-processed foods. Also no alcohol, because it's a class 1 carcinogen. You know, the data is the data. I really don't have any judgments on any of these things. I personally have been a vegetarian for many years, from 2003 till very recently. I've just only very recently started to eat a little bit of meat, and that's a personal decision. I have never asked my patients to be vegetarian. I don't think that I really believe that to be healthy, you do need good animal sources of protein. Okay? So that's where I'm coming from. That's my bias, all right? And that's just to set the stage for the discussion today. The episode today is going to be on a topic that has recently gotten a bit heated up, between the animal eaters and the plant eaters. Okay, and this is on advanced glycation end products. So what I've been seeing on social media is that each group is kind of almost yelling at each other. The plant-based group is saying that, if you eat animal-based foods, then you have a higher accumulation of the advanced glycation end products, otherwise known as AGEs, okay? Just to abbreviate it as AGEs. And then the animal-based group has kind of responded by saying, you do understand that we're talking about glycation, and, there's not, if you eat meat, there's no sugar in meat. And so glycation is related to eating carbs and sugars. So that's kind of where that conversation has been going. And I thought that today we'd spend some time maybe looking at this issue. There are no clear answers. Often in science, there are no clear answers. We hope that, we just get better quality questions every time we dig into a topic, right? I think good quality questions lead to good research, and then we get a little bit more information, and then we go from there. So we're probably not going to have any great answers here from this episode, but I just want us to make sure we're on the same page on this. So today's episode is going to be on advanced glycation end products in meat. Let's go. Okay, now you see, this is where the previous episodes come in handy, because I don't have to go through the whole thing again. So I will be referring to previous episodes, particularly the one that I did on carbohydrates. I believe that was episode 6. And I think the one on hyperglycemia was episode 8. Okay, so in that episode on hyperglycemia was when I first started talking about advanced glycation end products, otherwise known as AGEs. A very brief review is that, reducing sugars are able to form these bonds with proteins. And these reactions do not require enzymes. They just happen spontaneously over time. Now, when we have this glycation event and we form these glycation adducts or products, then what happens is that we can set up an inflammatory environment, because you're changing the shape of the protein, you're kind of gunking it up, changing its configuration. In addition, there are receptors on different cells that bind to these AGEs. These are the RAGEs, or receptors for advanced glycation end products, right? And when they do that, they set up really a lot of cell signaling for inflammatory responses in the cell. You create a lot of oxidative stress through the formation of free radicals and so forth, right? So these advanced glycation end products are quite damaging to the body. Now, in episode 6, when I talked about carbohydrates, if you remember, I specifically said that you don't need to eat carbs, but you absolutely need carbs in your body. Absolutely need carbs, okay? And I referenced the field of glycobiology, which is a fascinating field that I'm still trying to learn about. But basically, proteins are modified post-translationally, and we add sugar groups to them, and that's really important in signaling, for example, right? So that's one aspect where carbs are important, or sugars are important, outside of being fuel, right? Outside of glucose providing a fuel source. In addition, every living cell is covered by carbs, really, sugars, all right? Every cell has a slime of sugars around it, a coating of sugars around it called the glycocalyx. And our blood vessels are lined with this slime of sugars called the glycocalyx. And in fact, I will be doing an episode on the glycocalyx in the future, right? So we have the glycocalyx around cells, around blood vessels. It's protective. It helps in signaling. It really helps the cell stay healthy, okay? So while you don't need to eat carbs, you do need carbs, and your body makes its own carbs, and then it uses it for many important processes in the body, okay? Advanced glycation end products can be formed inside the cell, intracellularly, and extracellularly, okay? So they're happening all over in your body, both inside of cells and outside, okay? And generally, like I said, this is a spontaneous, natural process. Remember it from episode 6, I talked about the GAGs, glycosaminoglycans, right? These are the non-food carbohydrates, and they're very important in the extracellular matrix, very important in forming sort of membranes, being part of membrane structures even, okay? And, those are actually sugars that may be bonded to proteins in different ways, okay? So we have plenty of carbs in our bodies, and they are very important to the normal functioning of the body. So you don't need to eat carbs to get carbs. This is the first thing, because again, the idea that some people have is that, well, if you don't eat carbs, then you're not going to have these ages form. And that's not true. They're forming all the time in your body. Now, obviously, if you eat a lot of carbs, and if you eat a lot of sugars and processed foods, right, then with a higher sugar load, we're going to have more of these glycation events. So just because there's just a larger concentration and availability of those sugars now, we're going to see more of these glycation events in your body. And it's true that with diabetics, for example, because they are not controlling their blood sugar, right, and they have a lot of episodes of hyperglycemia, then it really predisposes them to increase age formation, and this is part of the disease process as well. However, even without a heavy dietary intake of sugars, you have glycation events occurring in your tissue. Now, if we think about the sugars that are most readily and easily glycated, these tend to have structures that are open, they have furanose rings and so forth. So there are particular structures that makes certain sugars more likely to be involved in those glycation events, okay? So the most easily glycated sugar is a pentose sugar. It is ribose. Okay, we heard about ribose in, again, episode 6 when I talked about carbs. See why I kind of tried to build those episodes so you can refer back if you want. So ribose, right? Again, where do we find ribose in the body? In nucleotides, in your DNA, in your RNA. That's what the R stands for, ribonucleic acid, right? So ribose sugars, it turns out, are the most easily glycated, right? Very, very quick. The next one is fructose, 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 okay? Because the structure also makes it glycate proteins very easily. And in comparison, if you look at glucose, glucose is not very exciting, actually. To be honest, with glucose, glycation events tend to be pretty slow. They take time. You really do have to have a pretty heavy glucose load for you to have a lot of glycation events with glucose, right? So with diabetics, again, that's a different scenario. But generally, you're going to have the ribose sugars glycate a lot more easily than the fructose sugars, but the fructose ones are also quite easily glycated. And then the least active ones for glycation would be glucose. Okay, so that's kind of the order when we talk about glycation. Now, how did this come about, this big argument of, meat products having a lot of ages and, plant products not having that much? Okay, first of all, as I said, we are making ages all the time within our bodies endogenously. So any living thing is making ages all the time endogenously. So whatever livestock or animal is out there that eventually gets eaten makes glycation products in their body. And when you consume them, or you consume the plant, right, because this happens in plants as well, then you are consuming what we call dietary ages, okay? But they're still ages. It just is that it happened in the organism that you are going to consume, right? So, and also with meat, you understand that with muscle, for example, we have storage of glycogen in there, so there's plenty of sugars in the muscle too. We don't normally think about it that way, but this, is something that we have to get used to. There is sugar in every cell, okay, and we have to kind of distinguish between sort of the sugars that are used for fuel and also functional sugars in our body, okay. So we have glycogen storage in muscles of animals, but every cell in an animal has plenty of carbs as well, and these ages can accumulate, okay? So knowing that, well, anytime you eat something, you're basically eating some ages here. But there was a research group, I think it was in the early 2000s, and they came up with sort of a database of different foods and how much of the ages you can find per food group, okay? So there are various ways that people assess age content in a food. So they can use spectroscopy, they can use high performance liquid chromatography, they use ELISA tests, right? So various ways for fluorescence, it's been a long day, you know what I'm saying. Even if you don't, doesn't matter. Okay, different ways to assess it. One of the difficulties in looking at the studies is that different groups use different ways to do it. Some methods are more accurate than others, okay, and some are easier to replicate than others. So in the early 2000s, we had this research group, and they started off, kind of building this database. And what they found in their studies, they used sort of an antibody against a certain type of age called CML, right? They found, based on their studies, that you had high age burden in meats and cheeses, so high protein and high fat foods, as compared to, things like vegetables and fruit. Okay, so that was really how this all came about. And the problem is that those studies have not been easily replicated. And in fact, people have done tests on food using the same type of antibody that they used in the first test, the CML antibody, and they've come up with completely different results, the opposite, in fact. They've come up with results saying that actually you have a lot more age burden in plants and vegetables and fruit. Okay, so the complete opposite. And now we start going, okay, so who's right? So one group starts saying, well, you have it more in meat products and in cheeses and in high-fat foods. And the other group saying, no, actually, it's higher in plants and fruits. So there's that confusion, and the database, to be honest, I don't think it's that trustworthy. Also, some of these studies relied on, actually a lot of them relied on what people reported they were eating or doing, which you always know is a problem, because who knows what they're eating. And, that kind of study you can't rely on for accuracy. So that's always been my big issue with any kind of nutrition study, right? So just to have that in mind. Now, when we talk about these ages, the most common one would be that CML that I talked about. CML stands for carboxymethyllysine, because really the amino acids lysine and arginine are the ones that are most easily kind of involved in those reactions with sugars. Okay, so you have this carboxymethyllysine, which we'll just call CML. It is the most common age product that we find. Now, when we look at ages, we can divide them into two groups. You can say there's one group that's non-toxic and there's one group that's toxic. And generally, it is believed that the toxic ages are those that cross-link with other proteins. So you have an age product, and then it also goes about cross-linking with other structures, right? And don't forget that you can cross-link not just with other proteins, you can cross-link with nucleic acids, you can cross-link with lipids, right? Other structures and molecules in the cell or in the cell environment, okay? So the belief has always been that the more toxic ones are those that can cross-link other structures. And CML is a non-cross-linking age, okay? However, studies have shown that CML can interfere with cell signaling, right? Can interfere with inflammatory sort of responses and, bring about apoptosis or cell death in certain immune cells. So it's not exactly clear if these non-cross-linking products are totally benign. Okay, so there's some indication that even the non-cross-linking ages are not good for you. Now, the most common ones that they discuss in these databases would be the CML and also something called methyl glyoxal. Methyl glyoxal actually can also be made in your body, right? And I will be talking about that in a future episode. But, that pathway is an inflammatory pathway in your body. And certainly you don't want to accumulate a lot of these MG products, okay? But it is an age that you can consume as well. And studies have shown that if you find a lot of CML age products in a food, then it correlates to the amount of mgs or methylglyoxal products that you will find in the food. So they kind of go together. If you see a lot of CML, you basically see a lot of mgs. That's what, the studies I've looked at have shown. So even if you have a study that didn't specifically look at the methylglyoxal products, right? If they found a lot of CML, there's this general understanding that the mg load or mg burden is also quite high. All right, now what do we know about how these products are absorbed? Generally being accepted that up to about 30% of these dietary agents are absorbed in the intestines. And it really depends on the molecular weight. The low molecular weight products are more easily absorbed and then cleared from the body. And the high molecular weight products take a longer time to be broken down and digested and then absorbed. 2/3 of absorbed AGEs are still in the body, 3 days later. They tend to be cleared by the kidneys. Okay, so there's renal clearance. And like I said, if you were making, or you are making these AGEs in your body at every point in time. But if you're generally healthy, you're not really having a huge age burden, your body can handle that because your kidneys will be getting rid of it. However, if you have a high sugar diet and you have a lot of glycation events in your body and you accumulate a lot of these AGEs, then obviously you are now taxing your kidneys and they can't keep up with that burden. So you would have a higher level of AGEs in the body. And this is also certainly true for people with kidney problems, renal problems, and their kidneys are not functioning properly, and so they will also be accumulating more AGEs in the body. All right, so that's what we know about the AGEs, and as I mentioned, they cause a lot of inflammation and have been associated with many diseases, with metabolic syndrome, with cardiac dysfunction. AGEs have also been seen to accumulate in muscle, in bone, even in fat. And generally in muscle and in bone, they are associated with poor quality muscle and bone, so osteosarcopenia, right? So again, wherever they accumulate, they're going to cause, inflammation, and they gunk up the tissue that they're in. We talked about the receptor for advanced glycation end products called RAGE, RAGE. We talked about that in episode 8, right? But there are other receptors that can also take up the AGEs. And these are like the scavenger receptors. And more recently, there's been this new protein. It's called an extracellular newly identified RAGE binding protein that has been shortened to NRAGE, EN-RAGE. Okay, so there are all these different receptors for these age products. Now, one that we've known about for a while is actually called AGER. Okay, so I know the RAGE stands for receptor for advanced glycation end products. AGER is advanced glycation end products receptor. So they put the receptor at the end. Okay, all right. So AGER is another type of receptor for those AGEs. AGER and these scavenger receptors, however, when they bind to the AGEs, what they do is they allow the cell to bring the AGE product inside the cell and eventually degrade it in lysosomes to break it down. Okay, so that AGER receptor, AGER1 receptor, tends to be protective because it's taking in any AGE products that they're seeing and breaking it down so that it doesn't have its destructive effect in the tissue. So if you don't have a lot of AGEs around, then you actually tend to downregulate the RAGE receptor, and you upregulate more of the AGO1 receptor. So you have more of these receptors that will take in the ages and break them down, and then they're harmless, okay? But if you have a high age burden, maybe because you're having a lot of sugars in your diet, or you're eating a lot of products with high dietary ages, then actually the RAGE receptor gets upregulated, and you have more of the oxidative stress, formation of reactive oxygen species, free radicals, that kind of thing happening. So there's a balance that needs to be maintained in the body. And with NRAGE, I thought I'd just mention it just because, you know, it's lately been shown that this NRAGE receptor has been, you know, correlated with very severe COVID cases. So people have respiratory distress or they have severe COVID, then they're likely to find high levels of this NRAGE protein in those patients, right? And that means they have high cytokine inflammatory load. It activates all your immune cells, and it interacts with the RAS system, the renin-angiotensin system, which I will talk about in a further episode. But just for you to know, it's a highly inflammatory system in your body. Okay, so now that we kind of have looked at these ages, one other thing I want to add is that there is a way to assess for ages in the skin that I think is interesting. It's called skin autofluorescence, okay? Skin autofluorescence, shortened to SAF. And essentially, they have an optical reader, and they use it to detect ages, advanced glycation end products, in the skin. So remember, you have lots of proteins in your skin, lots of collagen, right? And part of aging is this accumulation of ages in the collagen of your skin, so that you have more destruction and of that collagen, okay? And then people get all wrinkly and so forth, right? So think about it, you have protein, the collagen. Then if you are eating a lot of carbs, then you have a high sugar load, right? And then you're cooking at your body temperature of 97.8, let's say Fahrenheit, right? For 70 years, you're making plenty of these ages in your skin. And we can use this optical reader, this skin autofluorescence device, to check to see how much you have accumulated of this substance. And it's been useful, especially in people with diabetes, because it's actually been used as a good prognostic indicator. If someone has high accumulation of ages in their skin, then they're more likely to have complications and have, let's say, renal failure and so forth, have bad outcomes, right, with their diabetes. And you can predict these outcomes, 5 years out, right? So really, it's a nice way to look at a patient and give some assessment of how they're going to do in terms of the disease progression. It's actually much better than the hemoglobin A1C in assessing, again, disease load in the patient. Remember, the hemoglobin A1C is really only an approximation of, how much sugar, excess sugar has been in your bloodstream over the last 3 months, because it's based on the lifespan of the red blood cell. But these skin ages accumulate and stay in the skin. So they stay there for a very long time. And so you're able to see the burden of these ages in this person over years. Okay, so I think that that's an interesting device to look at. And lots of groups have suggested that we start looking at age accumulation through skin autofluorescence to assess and evaluate our diabetic patients with metabolic disease. Okay, so that's the SAF. All right, now that we've talked a lot about ages and the disease burden associated with that, what can you actually do about the ages? Because, it's still not clear, right? Whether you have more ages in meat products more ages in vegetable products, right? And in fact, some people have commented that people who are vegan or vegetarian, and the studies that show that they have higher accumulation of ages, that this is probably due to increased intake of fruits. And fructose is the main fruit sugar. And I mentioned that fructose is quite easily glycated, right, in comparison to glucose. So if someone is vegan or vegetarian and they have a high intake of fruits, that fructose load, if you're doing a lot of honey, agave nectar, that kind of thing, then that might be predisposing you to a higher load of ages. Okay, there's also been some discussion that you could have that age, glycation event happening in the intestines. So if you consume a lot of fructose and then, whatever proteins in the intestines at the same time, you could have that glycation event occur in the intestines and then it gets absorbed into the body. Although some experts think that this is only probably true for people with fructose malabsorption. Okay, so again, if we look at it, it's not clear. There is that group that says it's the meats and the high-fat foods that cause the problem. And then there's another group that says, no, it's the plants that cause the problem. But either way, you're getting ages in your food, right? It's also been unclear in the sense that if you've looked at people who have obesity, for example, and metabolic disease, some studies have shown that they don't have higher ages in their tissue, and the lean subjects have higher ages. So as you can see, it's a very murky field of study, and there's a lot of confusion there. But at least we should know that whatever you're eating, you are still consuming dietary ages. It's just unclear which food group gives you the highest dietary age intake, okay? But it is very clear that cooking methods are very much associated with, the age burden from food. So the higher the heat, the more likely you're going to have age formation. So anything that is processed with high heat, and a lot of the processed foods use high heat and dry heat for processing. And this is because, for their facilities and for their industry standards, it's just a lot easier for the food companies to control production of these processed foods, okay? So they do use those methods. So one quick thing that we can eliminate if we don't want a high age burden is just to get rid of processed foods, ultra processed foods especially, because they do tend to use high and dry heat. So anything that you fry, that you grill, right, broil, okay, those methods of cooking tend to use very high heat and dry heat. And, whatever you're cooking, you're going to have higher formation of ages in those products, right? So when we think about it, a lot of people like to grill their meats, for example, but that's not the best way probably to cook your meats. I remember, so 7 years ago, over the summer, because we teach all these classes, and Anna, who's our head grower, she's, that's our term for coach. Anyway, she asked me what she should talk about for class, and I said, well, why don't you talk, it's summer, talk about grilling and the dangers of grilling meat. And she taught that class, and she was the most unpopular person. They gave her such a hard time, my patients. I had to go in and say, look, she didn't personally decide that grilling would increase the formation of advanced glycation end products. It's not her personal decision. She's just giving you this piece of information, right? But people were very unhappy to hear that. But it is true, if you grill your meats, you tend to have more formation of those age products, okay? So you want to use lower temperatures. And it's better to have more moisture in your cooking methods. Now, bear in mind, full disclosure again, you're now listening to someone who does not like to cook, who tries very hard not to cook. And now I'm talking to you about cooking. So just keep that in mind. So, don't or minimize frying and broiling and grilling. And instead, you want to boil. Now, I can do that. I boil a lot of foods, right? So you can boil your meats. If you do, don't throw away the water. That's where all the electrolytes are. So you want to make that into a broth and have that as well, okay? But yeah, you can boil it because the moisture helps decrease the formation of these ages. You could poach, steam, right? Or if you like, those slow cookers, yeah, and you make a stew. Yeah, you see I'm grasping for words here when it comes to cooking. But yeah, you could do those things, right? And that would help decrease the formation of ages in your food. All right. It looks like that even if you do those things, you can find more ages in, things like beef as compared to poultry. And then there's more in poultry as compared to fish. And when it comes to fish, the studies I've looked at suggest that there's more age formation in the fatty fishes, like salmon, for example. But if you actually, again, change your method of cooking, you can really decrease the age burden. I think there was one study had to do with chicken, cooking chicken. Okay, this is why I'm struggling with it, because it had to do with cooking. I think they baked the chicken as opposed to frying it, and there was 4 times less age formation in the baked chicken. And basically in that study, they just told you to bake everything, which, hey, is fine with me because I don't like to cook and I hardly ever cook. But, even I thought it might be a stretch to bake beef. Even I thought, I'm not sure about that one. So, and, certainly I don't have any suggestions. I don't have any recipes for that. If someone comes up with it, please put it in the comments and share it with everyone else. I also think, those cooking competitions that they have, and they give you these impossible things to do. Well, maybe they should have a cooking competition, and they'll tell people to come up with like delicious recipes for baked beef, because I'm having a hard time thinking about how I'm going to convince my patients to bake their beef. So, Anna, you're going to have to work on that one. All right. So, yeah, baking is better. And then you bake your fish, you can bake your chicken, and maybe bake your beef. All right. Now, the other thing that you'll hear suggested is the use of marinades. Now, I don't like that term because, I don't know, you say that to a patient and you don't know what they're adding on the foods, right? So I want to be very specific. You should add vinegar or lemon juice, okay? Because if you lower the pH and you make it more acidic, then you have less age formation. I don't like the term marinade because a lot of times you have marinades with lots of sugars, right? So you have a glaze or some kind of marinade with, fructose in it, that kind of stuff. You're actually, in the cooking process, going to be forming a lot more of these ages. So that defeats the whole purpose, right? Everybody who's coating whatever they're cooking with glazes and all kinds of marinades, you'll want to think that one through. But do use vinegar and or lemon juice, lime juice to marinate your food products, okay? Long time ago when I did a medical elective in Brazil, the Brazilians love their meat and they have their churrasco, their barbecues. And what I noticed was that they would actually marinate their meat with vinegar for a few hours before actually doing the barbecue. And when I asked them, they would tell me, oh, it's just to make the meat more tender and more enjoyable that way. And I thought, oh, okay, that makes sense. But now that I think about it, it was also really decreasing the pH And therefore, when they actually barbecued the meat, they'd be forming a lot less of these advanced glycation end products. So that was pretty cool, right? Okay, so those are the things that you can do. And oh, one other thing I found, that if you are, for example, frying, and again, frying is high heat, you will have increased formation of ages. But you can minimize it by turning a lot, turning the food over a lot. And they did this study where they turned it once and then they turned it a few more times. And if you turned it more, you would have less formation of those ages. So if you're cooking, you don't want to just leave something there on the stove. You just want to be stirring it around and turning it over, because that will help decrease the formation of those age products. All right, so now where are we? Yeah, I get a little nervous when we talk about cooking because not a strength, clearly. All right, so besides cooking, what else can you do? Well, they've looked at supplements to decrease ages. There's a synthetic product that's an age inhibitor, aminoguanidine, right? That they've tried to use to decrease age burden. However, it does cause liver problems, anemia, GI issues, right? It impacts your immune system. So it doesn't look like we'll be using aminoguanidine soon to help decrease our age burden. You could try antioxidants, right? And this could be useful, but only for really the glycooxidation products, because there are many ways you can form ages, and sometimes the sugars can oxidize themselves. So the antioxidants would actually help with those products, but not when the sugars are glycated to proteins, okay? But still, you could do your favorite antioxidant of choice, you know, like your vitamin C or vitamin A or something like that. Now, also metal chelators have been found to be useful, because these can block the formation of reactive oxygen species and also these free transition metal ions that are very damaging, right? So you could use metal chelators like citric acid. Now, citric acid has been used a lot of times as a preservative, but it's a very good non-specific chelating agent. So you could use that. And then people have looked at pyridoxamine, which is a derivative of vitamin B6. Okay, with pyridoxamine, that product can chelate metal ions to inhibit your age formation. So you could try that. Benfotiamine is another product, which is a kind of derivative of thiamine, fat-soluble derivative of thiamine. That can also block age production. In addition, you can look at some of the products in tea, so black tea, the theaflavins in black tea, and the epicatechins in green tea can also trap certain ages and decrease your age burden, right? And then there are these antibacterial proteins called lactoferrin and lysozyme. Okay, so lactoferrin I've given to patients as an alternative sort of iron source. And both products, lactoferrin and lysozyme, you can find actually in milk, infant milk formula. So they've actually used it in the food system, right? And these bind to ages. So I think there's a product out there that they're trying to develop with lactoferrin and lysozyme, specifically to help bind ages. So those are some of the things that you can try, especially if you're having a meal that you cooked maybe through high heat. So if you stir-fried something or fried something and having that meal, then, you know, perhaps you could have it with some antioxidants, some of these chelators that we talked about, the B6, the thiamine, right? And maybe have a cup of tea with it. Right, so those may be some ways that we can help, you know, mitigate that burden. Right. Okay, so let's do our wrap up for now. We talked about advanced glycation end products and how they are formed endogenously in the body, but they can be acquired exogenously so we can consume it, right? Your body, every living organism, is making advanced glycation end products at any point in time. So if you eat anything, you're eating the advanced glycation end products that they have accumulated, right? And it doesn't have to be from dietary carbohydrates, because we have lots of carbohydrates in various forms in our body. We have it in our DNA, we have it within cell structures, we have it in the extracellular matrix, right? So we have plenty of carbs in our body, lots of proteins that also have carb groups attached to them, right? And these events can happen, as I said, inside and outside the cell. So anytime you consume any food, you are also consuming the ages that they have. Now, with regards to whether you have more age accumulation with meat products or vegetable and fruit products, plant-based products, we don't really know, because studies are really conflicting, and the methodology in doing those studies are problematic. So I think we need a lot more research on that. But the bottom line is, the way you cook your foods will have a lot to do with the accumulation of ages, right? Anytime you use high heat, dry heat, right, then you're going to make a lot more of these ages. So you want to minimize things like grilling, you want to minimize things like broiling and frying, and instead you want to prioritize boiling, baking, I suppose, at lower temperatures, and poaching, and then steaming, right, more moisture. So those are the ways that you should prioritize cooking. In addition, a lower pH, a more acidic environment, will decrease the formation of ages. So you can marinate your foods with vinegar or with lemon juice, and that will also help. When you're cooking, if you turn over your food a lot more, you also decrease the age formation in your body. In terms of what you could take in terms of supplements, antioxidants may be helpful. Some of these metal chelators could be helpful, and certainly flavonoids could be helpful. All right, so there's no clear, huge studies on these, but it just makes sense if you look at the chemistry that they might be beneficial, right? So yes, there are ages in meat, and depending on how you cook it, you could have a high age burden in meat, right? So people are not wrong to say that there are ages in meat, and it doesn't have to be because you're consuming a lot of carbs. That's the bottom line. Okay, I hope this episode was helpful. If it was, and if you found previous episodes helpful, please support this channel by liking and subscribing. And as I said, check out my website for the live stream Q&A sessions. And if you want me to talk about any specific topics, feel free to send me a message through my website, or really on the YouTube channel. You can put a comment. You can also find me on LinkedIn and Instagram. All right, that's it for now. So signing out from vlmd Rounds, I'm Dr. Vyvyane Loh, and I sing the body electric. Bye.